Hello, and welcome to the AgCulture Podcast. I'm your host, Paul Windemaller, and today I am filming here in New Zealand on my big travels that I'm doing in New Zealand and Australia, and I am sitting in the Gibson Valley here in central Otago, New Zealand. Today's episode, we're going to deep dive into the Canterbury region, which is the central eastern portion of the South Island of New Zealand, with a special guest who I've known for quite some time, Andy Macfarlane. He is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to New Zealand agriculture, especially Canterbury. He's been in operations in farming, both in dairy, deer, and across the board in crops for most of his career. And you're going to hear about that, as well as the interesting things in agriculture that are special to this region of New Zealand. Now, when I wanted to highlight this area of New Zealand, I couldn't think of anyone better than Andy. Andy has a long resume in New Zealand agriculture, which includes farm ownership, owning and starting Macfarlane Rural Business Consulting Firm, as well as being a current director on the board of directors for both ANZCO Food Company and Fonterra, which is one of the largest dairy cooperatives in the world, largest in New Zealand for sure. My wife and I actually spent a year back in 2011 and 12 working on Andy Macfarlane and his wife Trisha's farm. And we really enjoyed that experience. That gave me a wealth of knowledge in the grass-based dairy system, as well as a wealth of knowledge in running a dairy business. So we will spend a bit of time talking about his career and then highlighting the interesting aspects of agriculture, which include vegetable seed production, dairy farming, and the history of the Canterbury agricultural region. So stay tuned for this great episode. I know you'll enjoy it. I just want to say a big thank you to today's episode sponsor, SDG Precision Ag, your trusted partner in precision farming. As your local ag leader dealer, SDG Precision Ag offers full farm cutting-edge technology to optimize yields and improve efficiency. Trust SDG Precision Ag, an ag leader, to elevate your farming operation. Learn more at sdgprecisionag.com. So today I have Andy Macfarlane here with me. Andy and I have known each other, I think, for about 20 years now. So he's been an integral part of my career as it's been developing, as well as his wife, Trisha, who's very well versed in the farming enterprises and been a big support in your career as well.
Absolutely.
It all. So I couldn't think of anyone better to talk about what I wanted to discuss today is the agricultural history and diversity of the Canterbury region, which is the eastern part of the South Island of New Zealand. So, Andy, if you want to start out by giving us a little background on your career and kind of how that started and blossomed into several different aspects of agriculture and what you're doing today.
Thanks, Paul, and welcome back to Canterbury.
Yeah. It feels like home.
Second home.
Yeah.
No, it's great to have you and Brittany here. I was very lucky to land here in 1981. I went through Lincoln University, coming from a non-farming background, but with relatives and farming that triggered the interest. And then I worked in the North Island for 1 year, was offered a job down here in the private sector in the consultancy role. And I was just very lucky because the economic growth in Canterbury was being far greater than any other part of New Zealand in the time since the early 80s. Mm-hmm. And I think also this area is, because it's been subject to so much change, the farmers and the businesses in the area are more change ready as well. So that's a domino effect, because being change ready leads to more change, which means to be more change ready. And that's led to some opportunities. Early in my career here, we had the big restructuring of the economy in New Zealand when we took away all subsidies, all forms of support.
And that was back in the mid-'80s, right?
And that was back in the mid-'80s. And that led to some large-scale change, because we're all fighting for our own patch, if you like. So the survival of the fittest. But what did come out of that is a period of extended growth once we got through that initial shock, if you like. And that was a global shock as well, because it was, global interest rates were very high, inflation had gone high, and we really had to restructure things. So,
well, it really impacted New Zealand the hardest, probably, because at that time, like you said, the subsidies with heavily subsidized sectors all of a sudden overnight had zero subsidies. So,
yeah, probably New Zealand was never heavily subsidised in global terms, but we had sufficient subsidies in agriculture in particular that, just enough to make it economic for small farmers to survive, even though they were inherently unprofitable. But the biggest shock, to be fair, was some of the manufacturing sector, where we had large tariffs to protect internal sectors, and the government, at the same time as it took subsidies away, actually took tariffs away, which is the opposite of what's going on globally at the moment.
Right.
And that meant that some import industries where they were subsidised to produce in New Zealand disappeared. So car manufacturing disappeared, clothing manufacturing, a lot of that disappeared, footwear manufacturing disappeared. And so it zeroed into what is New Zealand's competitive advantage and how do we double down on that rather than trying to make something out of nothing. And so we did become a larger import economy because we went to the US or China or Vietnam or wherever in the world could economically produce stuff better than us. And sometimes it was our raw materials that went offshore to be manufactured, like merino wool, for example. So it meant that rather than all the manufactured garments made from merino wool being made in New Zealand, some of that went offshore, but they came back as the manufactured product. But out of all of that meant that we did realise that agriculture, rather than being a sunset industry, agriculture was a growth sector. We just had to work out which bits were really good. So since then, you've seen a growth in dairy, growth in kiwi fruit, and some other forms of horticulture. And even though the meat production sector has shrunk substantially in numbers, the productivity grew, and we've added a lot more value to the meat products and co-products before it left New Zealand. So New Zealand's almost gone, if I could characterise it a little bit, from a small B2C business to a large B2B business. If you think of New Zealand as a business,
right,
we have fewer labels owned in New Zealand, but we have a lot of product that contributes to the money that other people around the world can make.
Yeah. And so when you moved back down to the South Island, you started your career down here, spent some time working for another consultancy, and then decided to start your own consultancy at that time, right?
Yeah, I was an employee till 1987, and then we formed a partnership, and we also looked at the seed production sector and formed another company that is now part of PGW Seeds. And then in 1987, we formed Macfarlane Rural Business. So that whole part of my career was revolving around helping other people. So I spent a lot of time around the kitchen table with families, initially in the late 80s, early 90s, working out how to survive.
Yep.
And then working out how to leverage off the fact that we had survived a downturn. What does the future horizon look like? And the families that did well, have done well, they've worked really hard, but success doesn't come overnight. Success takes a long time, and so that's the really pleasing part of that. But what I realised, after maybe 20 years of doing that, is that it doesn't matter how successful you are as a farmer, if the post-farm gate sector is not really humming and really successful, then it doesn't matter how good you are as a farmer, you still can't make money. And so, luckily, I had a mentor who asked me to come into ANZCO, the meat industry, Sir Graham Harrison. He really mentored me into governance, and the meat industry is a fascinating sector. It's probably one of the most competitive sectors in the world.
Yep.
And we have to compete not only nationally but internationally for our beef, lamb and venison being the three key products. We're not big at all. In fact, we're net importers of chicken and pork in particular. And then we've got other sectors in the arable area in horticulture that is grown as well. So which in that eventually, in my case, led to me being on the Fonterra board, which is New Zealand's largest company. It's effectively the company is owned by co-op.
Yeah.
So it's owned by 8,250 farmers. We obviously export internationally, so we're about 79% market share of New Zealand's milk produced, but a number of other smaller companies have either started up in New Zealand or come from offshore interested in sourcing New Zealand product.
Yeah, and Fonterra would be one of the biggest dairy companies globally as well.
It's probably, the big four would be DFA, Arla, Campina, Fonterra. Mm-hmm. There's other ones that are growing, Lactalis, and so on, but we're in that major group.
Yeah.
And in New Zealand, I think the point of difference for New Zealand is that because there's only 5 million people in New Zealand, 96% of what we produce goes offshore. We export to the world, so you could argue we're the world's gap filler.
Yeah.
But we export to the world because the people aren't in New Zealand. So that's our point of difference. But it also means we have to accept volatility, and so the volatility can be in exchange rate, it can be in market fluctuations. We can't rely on the domestic market to give us stability, and I think that's something else that the exporters have to manage because of that volatility, but our producers also have to manage because Fonterra's point of difference, because we're a co-op and we have a large market share, and if you don't have both of those two, you can't do it. We can manage risk on the farmer's behalf, but only to a certain extent. So our milk price is volatile, just the same as our meat price is volatile.
And going back to the farm side for you, you've been involved in several different operations, including the one we're sitting on today, the home farm here, Pencarrow Dairy Farm in Ashburton.
Yes.
What did that look like? I guess let's talk. We'll back up first. Canterbury's agricultural history. How did that start? What did that look like? And then let's talk about kind of the boom that you experienced here.
Yeah. Look, Canterbury's a little bit different to most parts of the world because it was only settled in the mid-1800s. Right. And it was big, wide plains. When I say settled by Europeans, so the Maori had been here since about the 1300s, but very small population of Maori people, the native inhabitants. So they had a smaller impact on the environment, on the footprint. When the Europeans came, there was a settlement land grab, if you like. Just there was, like in other places like the US, and Canada. We're moving out. We were just probably 50 years to 100 years later than the US and Canada, but further to come down here. Yeah. And so the farmers the early settlers learnt some lessons about, what is the difference here. So we've got a very temperate climate. We're 44 degrees south. So in broad terms here, 44 degrees north in the northern hemisphere is predominantly a continental climate, and we're an island climate. So it can rain any time of the year. We don't get heavy snow in the winter on the plains here very often. Mm-hmm. It does make it more difficult, but we have got a niche for things we can grow. So the early settlers learnt that the soil here is more fragile because it's either low SEO or deposited by rivers. So we have braided rivers the same as Alaska, which deposits soil and shingle in equal amounts in various patches. And so you have to work around that. But if you continuously crop, like most of the continental soils, i.e. corn, soybeans would be an easy one, or wheat or wheat and canola, it doesn't work here. Our soils effectively become very fragile and they're subject to being blown away, which happened in the 1800s. So we need to keep our organic matter up, which means we need to farm with rotations or with pasture. The good thing about our climate, our temperate climate, is that we can grow ryegrass and white clover. We can grow pasture really well, whether it be on hill country in the North Island or further south of here on the plains here. What we have historically lacked on the plains is water. And in the Depression, some people said, wow, we've got mega amounts of water here. I wonder if we could take a little bit out of the rivers and distribute it through systems to stabilise our climate. So even when I moved here in the early 80s, irrigation was in its infancy. Even though the water had been available since the 1940s, 50s, irrigation was in its infancy, and we've learned how to become more and more efficient. So now on this farm, even when we thought we were hugely efficient in the early 2000s, we were using about 7,000 cubic metres of water per hectare per year, and now we're using less than 3,000.
And how much grass are you growing?
Our grass has grown. Our grass would have gone from 7 tonnes a hectare to 15 tonnes. But essentially, you could say our productivity's doubled with half the amount of water.
Yeah.
So if you looked at the metric of what's our productivity per millimetre of water used, it's 4 times. And that's been the trigger to a whole lot of other economic opportunity in Canterbury. But we've had these phases from the early settlers. It was a land grab. What do we do with this land? We'll start growing wheat. Well, soil blows away if you grow wheat too often. So then we got into rotation. So you need to have some restorative phases in the rotation to give you the buffer to have some depletive stages in rotation. So corn or wheat would be depletive. Something like peas, field peas, a legume would be neutral to slightly restorative, and white clover and pasture, and not white clover being a nitrogen fixer in pasture, adding organic matter and a restorative. So we aim to keep our soils in a wave, if you like, of slightly depletive, slightly restorative. But when we're in pasture like dairying, we're significantly restorative.
Yeah. So that really led to like you said, that kind of started out as the cropping right away, and then going more toward the pasture farming. But at that time, with the lack of infrastructure and irrigation, it was really more geared toward the lower yielding farms, like sheep and beef farms.
Yes.
At that time, right? And then that all kind of changed when you came around and the irrigation really started to pick up.
Yeah. In the 60s, 70s and 80s, the farmers a generation above me perfected the art of dryland sheep farming, and then you could grow intermittent crops in between, but the dryland sheep farming restored the soil. And of course, those were the days when the market for lamb, even in the early 80s, the market for lamb was the UK, Russia, Iran. And so frozen carcasses leaving New Zealand to go to that part of the world. It started all in the UK, but diversified. And then once the irrigation came on, we went to irrigated sheep farming, which meant our carcasses could be a lot bigger, and we could diversify our market spread. And we perfected chilled lamb, which meant, we put lamb on a boat in New Zealand, it's in the US in 3 weeks, or it's in Europe in 5 weeks, and it's nicely aged chilled when it gets to the plate, to the customer. But then we thought, well, how do you make irrigated pasture, how do you get a better conversion efficiency? And we pretty quickly worked out during the 80s and explosive during the 90s up to about 2015 that we could convert grass or pasture, because we're not differentiated from grass because it's grass plus clover. We could convert that to pasture more efficiently with a milking animal, which was the cow, which the North Island in New Zealand at that stage was pretty big on, always had been, but they produced about, from memory, about 80% of our milk. Now they're about 55% of our milk. And so we've grown this dairy industry in Canterbury and Southland as well, integrated with sheep. But the interesting thing about that is that our output of sheep meat and our output of arable crops has not gone down, even though a third of the land is in dairying, because the irrigation has meant that the yields of wheat have gone up significantly. We've brought in other crops that are totally dependent on irrigation, like pasture seeds, vegetable seeds. And we just slaughter our lambs at a different time of the year. So they're born in the hills. They come down here in the autumn after the cropping season. and we finish them in the winter, and they go out of here in huge numbers all winter into the early spring. So it's just a different system. So the whole basis of the migration of land uses will be how do you change systems to suit your natural capital that you have at the time. And the biggest introduction you'll have in terms of natural capital is the wise use of water.
Interesting. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the dairy boom that happened here in Canterbury, because it's a little different farming system, like you're saying, than the North Island. Typically, these farms in Canterbury are much larger and run more of a, I would say, concentrated system than what you'd see in the North Island. Is that right?
Yeah, we measure farming systems one by one. We say system 1 or system 5. So system 5 would be a significant proportion of imported feed. And when I say imported, not necessarily from offshore, but imported onto the farm. System 1 means you're totally self-sufficient on the farm. In the North Island, where they're winter warm, they can winter their cows on the farm all winter. We can't down here. So we're typically, the vast majority of farms in the South Island will be system 3 to 4, which means because we are seasonal calving, because we don't have a big local market for milk, so we don't need to produce fresh milk all year round. It goes into factories, we dry it, or we convert it to various powders or products, butter, cheese, cream cheese, mozzarella, whatever, all those breakdown products, what we call components. And so we have a seasonal calving system, so we typically calve 2/3 of the cows in August and 1/3 in September. And then everything is dried off during the month of May somewhere. And then all the cows have a holiday in June, July, which is obviously our winter. And typically what we do, because we don't grow enough grass for winter cold, in New Zealand in terms of winter cold, we get frosts.
Not Michigan.
Second day, not Michigan cold, not much snow, but we don't grow the grass because we are dependent. So they stay outside of winter. The vast majority of farmers in New Zealand, the cows would never be in a barn.
Yeah.
And so they go to typically a cropping farm or another block of land separate from the dairy farm that would grow winter feed. So it might be a fodder beet crop or kale crop, which is brassica, or winter green for cereal or something like that. And then they come back, grass is growing a little bit on the farm in the winter and they're ready to calve. And the scale of the farms is probably a little bit of a historical accident because most of the farmers in this area are 200 to 300 hectare sheep farms. So as those farmers have retired and sold, if a dairy farmer's bought them or the same families converted them to dairy, they happen to be, say, average 250 hectares, which means they're sort of circa 750, 800 cows.
Yeah. So, Andy, we talked about sheep and beef. We talked about dairy. One other unique aspect of Canterbury that I found really fascinating the first time I visited was how many seed crops are grown here that supply, around the world. And with that unique climate you have, the soils that you have, very conducive for growing those really special high-end seed crops. So why don't you explain to us a little bit what are some of those crops that are grown here for seed in Canterbury, and then the supply chain and what that looks like from farm to getting it exported.
Yeah. It's a fascinating industry and quite a challenging industry, I have to say, it's difficult, quite volatile in terms of the yield, the income per hectare. But what we realised over time is that Canterbury was blessed with having a few natural attributes. Our latitude at 44 degrees and an island climate meant we were pretty temperate, so much lower climatic risk for vegetables. We don't have snow to smash it down or excessive rain, excessive drought, but we mitigated any drought potential that we had on the plains with the irrigation system. So that was good. But we also had a history in Canterbury of farmers that understand arable farming, they understand rotations, had the machinery, so we had, and the town had the infrastructure with dressing plants and that sort of expertise. And so some people came from overseas that had the IP, particularly from the Netherlands actually, that had the IP for growing vegetable seeds to say, we've got to diversify our production base. And, of course, there's a benefit in having a Northern Hemisphere base and a Southern Hemisphere base, because then you can mix. Sometimes you can do two crops in 1 year.
Right.
But the things that have been particularly successful in Canterbury have been things like red beet, carrots, radish, and some of those crops will be roughly 50% of the world's seed production. And so
50.
Yeah, 50.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of that crop doesn't, it's exported again, so we get it to the dressing stage in bulk, and then it goes to, might be the Netherlands, for example, with carrots, and it's packaged down to smaller amounts and it's distributed. So we've brought overseas people's IP in here and expertise to get it at that production phase, and we're now, I think, for some of that area where our climate happens to be a good niche, we've got some global expertise in some other seeds like spinach, for example, cabbage, some of those things that need fertilisation in the winter if they're got to be carried through the winter or the spring sown, but you don't want to be too hot and not too cold. And so that's diversified our arable systems to give us break crops that are more profitable. Mm-hmm. Because right now the average arable system isn't as profitable as the dairy system. But the other thing that you need and a key part of that is hybridisation. So a lot of the vegetables we grow in our vegetable gardens at home are actually hybrid seeds, which typically means you need, for every 24 rows of female, you need 4 rows of male to fertilise them. You then destroy the male and you only harvest the female. But the hybridisation part is important. We've got a very good climate for bees, so most of those crops require a big population of bees. Mm-hmm. And bees like living around here. It's pretty temperate. They don't get blown away or fried or whatever, but we have to have gaps. And so with the advent of the dairy industry, you have to have from one crop of radish to another crop might have to be 2 kilometres distant, so the bees don't cross-pollinate various varieties. So the hybridisation and the isolation factor is actually quite important. But that's led us to a big diversification of the arable sector, just the same as we've seen a diversification in the meat sector, because we're now not just producing meat and then having a lot of blood and bone as the co-product.
Right.
We now produce other high-value co-products for the world. It might be jerky that goes to beef jerky that goes to the States, might be blood products, serums, all of those sort of things that where we can biomedical. We can do some of those things that we didn't used to do. So we're making the most out of every kilo of what we produce, whether it be milk or meat or vegetable seeds or other arable seeds.
Yeah. Now, in the seed business, arable farmer didn't just say, okay, I'm thinking I'm going to plant 20 hectares to radish seed this year. What's that look like? How does that relationship work? Because, you look at the Midwest and a corn and soybean farmer says, I'm going to grow 60% of my land to corn and 40% to beans this year. And when I harvest, I'm going to bring it to the co-op in the mill in town, and they're going to buy it from me, right?
Life's not that simple in New Zealand, Paul, as you know. Typically some of our crops need a 12-year rotation, which means you could only grow 1/12, but call it 10 to 12 years. And other crops we could grow one every 5 or 6 years. So things like potatoes, so sometimes we grow seed potatoes and sometimes processing potatoes. They typically need a 10 or 12-year rotation. Mm-hmm. Some of our vegetable seed crops would need at least 6. So some things like carrots and beet, I would always have a big crop gap, and that's because not just managing the soil, but managing regrowth seeds to grow from the previous harvest. Mm-hmm. You need years to get rid of them because you don't want to contaminate the next crop. So that means sometimes we will be planning a decade out, and we'll be looking at a decade back in past history to make sure we have not only clean paddocks from a contamination point of view, but we don't get any disease, and we've got to also think about our neighbours up to 2 kilometres away to make sure that their bees don't travel to our paddock or our bees don't travel to their paddock. So there's a lot of balls to juggle, and so that means that the companies, the agronomists, and the agronomy companies that process these seeds and give the farmers advice, they also have to plan to make sure which farmer can do what. So it's a little bit complex. And so you're juggling a lot of balls because New Zealand can't survive in the world. We can't compete with the likes of the US or South America on corn or soybeans, not that we grow soybeans in New Zealand, or Australia with wheat. Mm-hmm. We're the gap filler, so we do the stuff that's a bit more difficult. And that suits our soils and our climate.
Yeah. Andy, what are some of the challenges that Canterbury specifically faces in agriculture right now, whether that be the dairy sector, sheep and beef, or arable?
I think the challenges all relate largely to the environmental, the footprint, because when we expanded our irrigation area significantly through from, say, 1990 or mid-80s to mid-2000s, when you increase your productivity, but also there's a danger of system leakage. So that might mean if you're putting more water through the soil, you drag more nitrogen through, so are our nitrates going up? Yes, they are. And by global standards, our nitrates aren't high, but New Zealand's set a very high crossbar in terms of what good looks like. And so we moved from a situation in the 80s where we were looking for economic survival and what could we do to make more money to pay the interest bill and interest. In my early days got as high as 21, 22, 23%. And any surge in interest rates since has looked a bit tame. Like the GFC, we had a surge, the Asian crisis, we had a surge, and now this last 2 years, post-COVID, we've had a surge, but nothing's really gone over 10-ish% since then. So with my generation are very lucky we haven't, we got in because of high interest rates. It was an opportunity because nobody could see a future in agriculture. And now we've just had to muscle up to sort of cyclical variations. But once we got through that and we realised we could develop farm systems that we could make economically successful, we've now had to address the challenge of, well, how do we lower our footprint, whether it be nitrates into the groundwater or in more recent times, methane. There was a global challenge around how much methane cows producing or animals producing. So in New Zealand's case, our sheep numbers have come down from 70-odd million in the mid-90s, early 90s to 27 million now, but our output of lamb is the same. And our absolute number of dairy cows has gone up, but our dairy cows are much more efficient per kilo of methane. And the reason they're more efficient per kilo of methane is they're more efficient per kilo of feed or dry matter consumed.
Right.
So, but of course, there's a bit of a global debate as what's agriculture's responsibility or share of having to sort this stuff out versus the fossil fuel sector, which has got massive leakage, whether it be through pipes or whatever. So, and rice produces methane because you've got very wet soil, for example. So the debate is how do we all do our bit? And of course, in New Zealand, we're a minuscule percentage of the global output. But if you want to walk the talk, you have to walk the walk and say, well, we'll do our bit. So we're trying to be the most efficient we can. So our initial focus is on methane output or system leakage, and I could expand that to nitrogen and so on as well. But what is our output per kilo of product produced? In other words, efficiency.
Yeah.
And that's a good value proposition for farmers because every farmer wants to be more efficient.
Because it makes them more profitable.
Because it makes them more profitable. And it's been a tenuous link as to how does that relate to nitrogen output, how does that relate to methane output. So But because of our climate, where Ireland will be the closest to us, we can go back to our roots of growing a lot of white clover in our pastures, which means less synthetic again. We grow that, so that's less nitrogen loss per kilo of product, whether that be an arable product or meat or milk. And you could argue that, and then it's the same with methane. How do we make it most efficient per kilo? Because our customers are interested in the amount per kilo produced, because that's what they buy. They buy a kilo, pound of butter, or
they're not buying a cow.
They're not buying a cow. They're buying a pound of butter.
Yeah.
But the regulators in New Zealand, they're interested in the absolute amount as well. So the regulator wants to reduce the absolute amount. Our customers want to reduce the relative amount, or the intensity of that. So, but what we're now finding is that as we're looking at mechanisms to improve the intensity measurements, we're also reducing the absolute amount. And look, we've got a long way to go on that. But in this farm here, we started farming here. We were lucky to get into here in 1989, and it was poor irrigation. We spent the first 10 years really developing the irrigation, and we've got 3 iterations of that now. So we've gone from water dikes, which is a flood irrigation system, to moving irrigators, we call rotorunners, to center pivots, and we've now got our first underground drip, 300 millimetres or 15 inches under the ground. So we're saying, well, how do we get the most efficient irrigation system? And that's led to a doubling of our production. But all these technologies stack, such that animal genetics, it's our irrigation system, it's our fertiliser system. We now precision apply fertiliser, so not every part of the paddock gets the same amount. We're precision testing, because we know that animals transfer. They eat in the sun and they sit and shit in the shade. So we get transfers, and of course on hill country we go to another level with that. So how do we use technology to make our inputs more efficient while still increasing our outputs? So what's happened is that our output per animal run and our output per hectare, if you're arable, has gone up. We started here, I did the economics converting to dairy on this farm. That was out of bull, beef, sheep and arable. I did the economics in 1999 based on 850 kilos of milk solids a hectare. We're now doing 1,600-ish a hectare.
Almost double. So pretty close to double.
Almost doubled. And our footprint increased significantly for the first half of that period. And now our footprint's come down. So the key thing is, really, for the last probably 7 years, our output's been static while we wrestled to the ground how to get our footprint down. So our output levelled off and our footprint's gone down by 40%. And now what we're trying to do is stabilise or drop the footprint more, but start to lift the output a little bit again. So we've sort of had a bit of a holiday on the productivity side where we worked out these interactions, which we need damn good science. And from my point of view, I've got an agricultural science background, so I've tried to help out parts of industry that are doing that work, whether it be the universities or CRIs, to say, as farmers, we need to help these people, but we also need to give them guidance as to these are the things we need you to focus on to help us in the production sector to get it right.
Do you see technology playing a part in that at all?
Oh, it's huge. And I think technology is about shortening the feedback loop. So the more we can do to shorten the feedback loop, if I put my farmer's hat on, we almost want instant gratification. It's like the cell phones, isn't it? If I can observe something in the paddock, how quickly can you tell me whether my gut feeling's right or wrong? And how can I turn that around again to change my process, to change my system, to make it work? And so something like, the very simplest form, one of our earliest forms of speed of feedback loop was irrigation sensors to say that we're in the paddock, to say you're overwatering or underwatering or you need more. And it didn't matter where I was in the country, I could see what my water level was. And now the latest thing on this farm, they've put the rumen bolus, into the cows. And so we're seeing stress, whether it be temperature rise or activity changes, that can lead to say, well, that cow's about to go lame, or the early stages of lame, or she's got mastitis, so we're getting in mastitis. We've seen the mastitis 2 or 3 days earlier than we previously were, which means our average somatic cell count has gone down 30,000. But that also means we've got more alternative forms of control. So rather than antibiotics, we can have pain management. Mm-hmm. We've got more options available. So all of that stuff is huge. The key issue is, and I think this is the challenge for our farming systems globally, farming's a game of limiting factors. So if you've got the world's best technology, but you haven't got good management or decision-making processes or infrastructure, whether it be soils or whatever, then you're only as good as your most limiting factor. Right. So we need to make sure that technology goes forward at our rate, at the same rate as our ability to utilise it. And that will be different for different farms and in different areas.
Right.
But not always what we expect. I've spent some time in Africa, and we look at, they're going to jump the technology curve for some of that stuff because they've missed out on 60 years of the mistakes we've made. So they'll be able to jump from one place to another. So I don't think it's technology's a monopoly of the world's most developed farming economies either.
Yeah, it's probably going to open the doors for those developing countries just as quick as it will for a place like New Zealand or the US.
Yeah. And our biggest weakness, I think, in those developed countries is we suffer from confirmation bias, where we say, well, this is the way we've done it, so it must be right. And sometimes, and where it's new, where you've got a new farming system, you don't have anything to compare with.
Right.
But technology can challenge your confirmation bias as well and say, oh, what I thought, this might not be, might not be the right way to do it. And you have a sort of an oh shit moment and you think about, right, well, what am I going to do now?
Yeah. Andy, before we wrap up here, I just want to get it, you've been a mentor to me in my career, and you've helped a lot of other young people through the beginning of their career in agriculture. Mm-hmm. What words of advice do you have for listeners that are kind of starting out in their career, or maybe are in a professional situation that want to jump to ownership in a farm or their own agribusiness?
Right, so this is off the top of my head.
You didn't prepare for this one?
No, what you're getting is what comes off the top of my head. But I think firstly, I'm a massive optimist about food production, and I think if we think about what we do as food production or food and fibre rather than just agriculture, we have to take the rest of the world with us. And I'm seeing it at the likes of Lincoln Uni, our agriculture university, which has got the most interest it's ever had, most students it's ever had. So firstly, I think food production's got a future. Secondly, it doesn't matter which part of the value chain you want to be in, whether you want to be in the production side, the advice side, or in the processing side. And I've been lucky to be in all parts of that supply chain in my career, and I hope to be still adding value to that for a long time to come, is there is a future, and you should never suffer from the barrier, say, I can't do this. You must have a can-do attitude. Surround yourself with people, with successful people that can help you, who are also positive thinking, because actually if you believe you can do it, you will find a way. And over my, whatever it is, 44 years in the industry, I've had so many people say to me, you can't go farming. It's impossible. You can't start from scratch and go farming. You're a good example of somebody that has, and there's multiple examples in New Zealand, but I could go anywhere in the world and find people at will. And I think the opportunity for young ones now is that there are a number of people that might own the assets that don't have the skills or don't have the personal interest in being the farmer, mm-hmm. but they have things that they can work with people on. And so I think skills and work ethic and intelligence and attitude will be just as highly valued wherever you want to look in the future. So work hard, make sure you know them, and look for opportunities, and they come.
Andy, thanks so much for your time today. Appreciate it. Sharing your wisdom and giving us a background on agriculture in the Canterbury region in New Zealand. It's a place that you're very well known and very well versed in. So thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks, Paul. Honor to have you in Canterbury. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to another great episode of the AgCulture Podcast. I really enjoyed doing these on-location recordings, and I hope you enjoyed my discussion with Andy Macfarlane, who has been a big mentor in my life and a big advocate for young people in agriculture, coming into agriculture. I want to thank him and his wife, Tricia, for their hospitality on this trip, and as well as many times I've been here in New Zealand before. Don't forget to tune in next week for another exciting episode here on location in New Zealand. We will continue to roll these out for the next few weeks. I'm Paul Windemaller, and we will see you next week for another exciting episode of the AgCulture Podcast. Thanks for listening.